Money Guy, live on
That Money Show with Gabriel Nussbaum on FUBAR Radio.
Hello everyone and welcome to That Money Show with me, Gabriel, That Money Guy, live on FUBAR Radio. And it is time to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to make you better with your money, well, than you are right now. I think that's a pretty good thing to get out of a show. Anyway, welcome to the show that, like I said, does one thing and one thing only. It improves your financial well-being, your financial health, your financial knowledge, and it does it through various different mediums. Number one, we bring up the news. What's going on? What's happening in the economy that's actually relevant to the money in your pocket? And then number two, we bring in a range of guests, a range of experts, a range of famous faces who will share their own personal advice, tips and tricks with you to, again, make you better with money. And coming up this week, we've got two incredible guests. We've got William Ailes, the co-founder at Refundee, as well as Vix Layton, the comedian and host of the Spendology podcast. But before I bring in either of them, we're going to do something a little bit special because it's the end of the year. And what we are going to do is we are going to take a look at what I and my guest, who I will introduce in a second, believe to be the top economic stories of 2024. So we can have a little bit of a highlight reel or a low light reel. We'll find out soon, depending on what are the stories that we picked. But anyway, joining me right now on That Money Show is Amy Knight, the writer at NerdWallet. You should know her by now. Amy, welcome back to That Money Show.
Thank you for having me back. How are you doing, Gabriel?
I'm doing very well, and I'm quite excited to take a little bit of a look back at the year. I mean, what a year it's been, I suppose, for anyone involved in personal finance or financial journalism.
Yeah, no shortage of stories this year.
Absolutely not. And we've had to pick our top ones, and I saw you submitted quite a few. We've had a few conversations, and I think there are three in particular that have stood out. And why I think this is really important for people to hear about is because if you haven't heard about these stories, they are still relevant to you right now. So don't just think that they're old news. They are very much still current news. So, Amy, is there any top story that you would like to kick us off with, actually? I'll let the guest have first choice.
Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you. I would like to start, if I may, with something that hit the headlines in May, which was inflation finally hitting the Bank of England's 2% target. And this has been a goal that it feels like as a country we've been working towards for such a long time. And we finally got there. We started 2024 with inflation around 4%. And just to remind everybody, inflation is the rate at which the price of stuff is going up. So the rate at which the price of products, goods, services, it's going up. And in May, finally, it hit the 2% target. And that opened up the possibility of interest rates, which I think we're going to come on to in a minute.
Oh, I like that. A little bit of a sneak preview for the next part of the show. But I agree. This was a massive financial highlight of the year, hitting that 2% goal, like you mentioned, which is the Bank of England's target rate for inflation. We don't want inflation to go down to zero. We like it to kind of be a slowly trickling up factor, because otherwise we'll be close to deflation, which has a very, very detrimental effect on the economy. And like you mentioned, we hit 2%. Just 2 years earlier, 2022, we were looking at that 11% figure, almost an all-time high. An all-time high in my lifetime for sure, as far as I can remember in the UK, of 11%, which was pretty crazy. And coming back down to that 2% almost made things feel normal again. But I will stress the almost, because we're not quite out of the woods, are we?
We're not. So inflation stayed above 6% for most of 2023, and that put massive strain on everybody's budgets. And when you're living in a high inflation economy, it becomes even more important to keep a close eye on your budget, to review your spending regularly, and also to watch out for price increases for the things that you buy regularly, because if you're not watching it carefully, you can find that you're spending a lot more than you realize just on your essentials, and that can tip you into overspending and can unfortunately lead some people into financial difficulty and debt. And I wanted to mention about shrinkflation, which is a version of inflation that may be less familiar, which is where without seeing a price directly increase on the shelf, you're actually getting less for your money because the product has got smaller.
For anyone that's ever opened a bag of crisps in their entire life, you should know what shrinkflation is, because every year you seem to open up that bag of crisps. I won't name any brands in particular here, but you open it up and there just seems to be not enough in there. Less and less every year.
More air, less food.
More
it's
air.
happened with lots of chocolate and biscuits as well. So the packet has maybe got a few less biscuits in it. Or if you buy snack bars in a multi-pack, what used to have 8 bars in a multi-pack, maybe it now has 7. So these are things to just keep an eye on. And there are some useful tools and online sites that can actually help you compare across different supermarkets, gram per gram, what are you paying for? And you can trade down. So if you're used to buying fancy branded snacks, if you trade down to the supermarket's own version, you may find you're going to get more for your money.
I love that. A lot of tips to save some money. And I think on inflation, 2 key points that I always stress whenever this topic comes up. Number 1, just because inflation is lower than it was last year and definitely lower than it was 2 years ago, doesn't mean that that inflation isn't now baked into the price of things you're paying today. We haven't had deflation. The price of things haven't gone down. So what has happened in the past is now part and parcel of what we're seeing. It's 2% from last year, but that does include the 6% from the year before and the 11% from the year before that. And the other thing I always like to say about inflation is that inflation is a number based off a basket of goods from, the figures put out by official statistics, but you might have your own personal inflation level. And that's always really important to stay aware of. The things that, like Amy said before, the things you're buying on a weekly basis, because those items and the inflation on that might differ to the statistics that we're looking at. Okay, story number 2, Amy, what have we got?
Well, as we alluded to, when inflation starts to calm down, it means that the Bank of England, who set the interest rates for the country, are able to look at lowering the base rate of interest. The base rate of interest has been climbing like a staircase. If you go on the Bank of England's website and look at the graph, it literally looks like a set of stairs, because they made 14 consecutive rises to try and cool demand, basically to make people buy less stuff to keep inflation down. And it went up, and they held it at 5.25% for almost a year. And then finally, another good news story, they made the first interest rate cut in August. They only shaved off 0.25%, it went down to 5%. We've since had one more little cut. So in November, they took another 0.25% off. But the fact that it's beginning to come down is a positive thing if you're hoping to borrow money, particularly if you're hoping to get a mortgage.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, we had, well, again, for this generation, the younger generation, what feels like record high interest rates, because over the past decade or so, we've had record low interest rates, which is interest rates below 1% set by the Bank of England. And it is Bank of England's one of their key tools to fight inflation is the interest rate, which they set. And obviously borrowing and saving products tend to follow what the Bank of England does with their own rate. So the Bank of England shot it up to try and cool down the hot inflation that we were just talking about, which for a lot of people, those of you especially that are on a mortgage product, probably felt very painful to a lot of you out there. Savers, on the other hand, had a bit of a field day, because all of a sudden, all of the best savings accounts shot up, and you all of a sudden had saving accounts that were more than 1%, which was nice for a change. Hopefully we will have some kind of return to a more normal rate, not the super low or the super high, somewhere in the middle that both savers and borrowers can tolerate and live with in the near future. But things aren't going quite as quickly as expected, are they? People thought the base rate, which is the interest rate that the Bank of England set, would be a little bit lower right now, if not be coming down a little bit quicker than it currently is in the start of 2025, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore.
That's right. there have been a couple of spanners thrown in. Firstly, the Chancellor's budget, because Rachel Reeves have got all these big plans for spending and investment, which is fantastic for economic growth, but there's a risk it's going to cause more inflation. So there's this worry that inflation is going to rear its head again and be more of a nuisance. And that will keep the Bank of England stuck in this situation where they can't lower interest rates because they have to keep a lid on inflation. And then the other thing that's cropped up is the outcome of the US election. There's a potential that some of the policies that are going to be implemented over that side of the pond could also impact inflation over here. So the Bank of England are going to be making even more of a cautious approach to bringing that rate down.
Yeah, I mean, the Bank of England are a naturally cautious organisation. They will always do things a little bit slower than people want them to do. And like you just mentioned, a few pieces of news that came out after they started to lower interest rates further escalated that level of caution that they were going to take into account. Is there anything that people can do before we do dive into the budget, which you did briefly just mention as one of the reasons why interest rates aren't dropping quite as quickly as we expected? Is there anything people can do to manage expectation around current interest rates?
Yeah, I mean, these stories link together. And one thing I wanted to just pick up on, if interest rates stay higher for longer, you mentioned that that's a good thing for savers. If you are in a position to put some cash away, it might be time to break up with your bank and look at where you can get a higher rate of interest. At the very least, the money you have saved needs to be earning more interest than the rate that prices are going up, so more than the inflation rate. So if your bank can pay you enough interest that you're beating inflation, that's good news, and you might need to move your money and shop around in order to do that. If you're in the borrower's camp, it's really important to do your own sums on affordability. So you can head to the NerdWallet website and find our mortgage calculator, plug some numbers in, see how increasing your deposit, stretching the term of your mortgage can make your repayments more manageable. And although your lender will do a stress test on you and they'll say, this is what we think you can afford, you don't necessarily have to take that and stick to it. You are in control. It's your money. It's your borrowing. So you need to work out what you feel comfortable with.
All right, Amy, I'm really going to put your financial journalism to the test here. We've got 60 seconds to cover one more story, and that story is going to be Labour's first budget in 14 years.
Big shock in the budget was the national insurance contributions for employers.
There we go.
They knew it was going to go up a little bit. They did not know it's going to go up as much, and that the threshold would change as well as the rates. It sounds like a business story when you first look at it, but it has the potential to impact workers as well, because when your company is having to pay more tax, it means they've got less room to take on headcount or give you a pay rise.
Or if you're a consumer, it means prices could start to go up. Inflation, let's have a little look out for that next year, because
Absolutely.
things might start to change drastically off the back of that budget. Amy, you've done a brilliant job